everyone, my presentation is called Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and I compare different transportation types. So if we were to look, in most of the research that I did, the main thing that I found is before you can really pick a best mode of transportation, there's a lot of variability in that because a lot of it depends on the per person emission of CO2. So if you're on a empty plane and you're the only person flying it, then that's far worse than if you're on a plane that holds 300 and something people, versus if you drove in a car by yourself or in a bus by yourself. And so depending on the per passenger usage of a CO2 emission and how efficient you're being in your traveling or how efficient companies are being, that oftentimes will make one better than the other. And the transportation mode and how technologically advanced it is. So boats and trains and planes and all of the cars that we have now are trying to become more fuel efficient. So depending on when your mode of transportation was manufactured, it could be a lot better than another mode of transportation. But if you just look at some of the statistics, it looks like airplanes emit about 53.3 pounds of carbon dioxide per mile, but that could be 0.24 pounds of gas per passenger per mile depending on the size of the aircraft. I looked up statistically how many miles planes travel in the year just because they are emitting such a high level of CO2, and I read something about how it's worse because they're up in the upper atmosphere. And they travel about 5 billion miles per year, but that's not an exact number because obviously you have cancellations and non-commercial flights that couldn't be counted. But if you consider the impact that just flights alone are making on the environment, there's a lot of pressure to consider either not flying, or a lot of plane companies have developed offsets for when they do fly. Then there are trains. Trains, I was reading about the Eurostar trains in Europe, and they average about 0.0887 pounds of CO2 per mile, which is great. And they're seen as a very viable option in several places. The issue is that they're not as viable an option in the United States, which is something that I think has been trying to be advanced in recent years. There's a lot of variability in technology in trains. You have Eurostar trains that have these really low emissions, but then you have your traditional locomotives or freight carriers that are maybe not so good for the environment. Boats, you're talking about 1,660 pounds per a trip, about 0.55 pounds of CO2 per mile for a long cruise. But from what I read on cruise ships is that most of the time you have to drive to get to your destination or your port to leave, or fly. So that cuts into how great they are. Cars average 20 miles to the gallon, or 0.78 pounds per mile of CO2. There's a lot of variance though, like I said. So a Prius versus a truck, you're going to get very different results. And how full is your car? So if you're riding to a place by yourself, or if you have to take two cars to get one place, or you're going with a whole group of people and you're all going to just drive and caravan down, is that more efficient than just, taking a full plane? And so those are the kinds of things you have to think about. So why is it that CO2 is emitted when you're traveling? It comes from carbon being released from the gas in the vehicle that you're traveling in, and the burning of the fuel releases CO2 in the air when the oxygen from the air forces combustion when combined with the CH4 in the gas. So you get a CO2 emission. Us versus the world. Our transportation, we emit 15% of the world's emissions. And I did some math on that. So if you think about the fact that 28% of our emissions are the result of transportation just for the U.S., then 4% of the world's emissions come from our transportation sector alone. Why do we care? So I read a really interesting site, and you can see the link for it right there because I felt like it was one of the better sites. According to NASA, the world will become warmer, and some regions will become warmer and have warmer temperatures, others won't. Warmer conditions will lead to evaporation and precipitation overall, and individual regions will either become wetter or drier. Then a greenhouse effect will warm oceans and melt glaciers and other ice, increasing the sea level. So ocean waters will rise and contribute to the level of sea rise. And then some crops and plants will respond well to that, and then some will not respond as well to that. And so you'll see a change in areas where some crops will grow better, some crops will move to different locations, and just the makeup of communities will change. And then as the crops and plants change, animals are then affected and ecosystems are affected as animals lose habitats and resources, and then they have to move. I read that it's affecting Arctic regions the most because they're so extreme to the poles. And so you have the temperature and sea level rising, making a huge difference in those ecosystems. Why should I care? Because it's global temperature and sea levels rise, we have houses where they will rise. And if animals are affected in plants, we eat those, so that directly affects us in our food source. And because we have to have those things to show our future generations and to keep our ecosystems in balance. And if greenhouse emissions get out of control, we end up with no water, no plant lives, and in essence, kill the planet. And so the NASA site showed Venus, I believe, which has really high CO2 emissions, and this is what it looked like. And so it was talking about how if you just continue to go out of control, the potential repercussions, but their emissions are way higher on Venus than here. What could you do? Just as an individual, I've just been thinking about how I could travel less or do so more efficiently. Use electricity to cool my house at home a little more efficiently and recycle. Whenever I did my carbon footprint, those were the big three that I was contributing to CO2 emissions on. As a nation, I think we could all try to reduce our carbon footprint some. Like I was mentioning earlier, some airlines and now some ships are starting to develop offsets. So when you buy a ticket, you can donate to have a plant or a certain number of plants planted to reverse the effects of emissions on the environment. In the political sphere, I know the Paris Agreement was very debatable, but I think addressing that and moving forward is with global change and maybe being active politically to try to vote for people that are advocating global change. Development of rail travel, I think, is a really interesting idea because rail travel is so efficient. It's probably one of the better modes of transportation. And if you think about any of those things being done on a small level, it begins to add up. And just looking at the potential to cut emissions by millions or even billions if you just did one thing like go to train travel instead of flying a plane. My personal footprint that I did, I made 42,256 pounds of CO2 emissions because I commute and because I use my air conditioning so much. It's been so hot. I could raise my thermostat in order to reduce my bill and reduce my carbon footprint. I go to school right now. I'm hopefully done in December, so I'll be done commuting. So I'm hoping that will reduce my footprint as well. And there are my works cited. Thank you.